If I asked you to tell me how Christianity got started and spread, you would probably point me to the Book of Acts. After all, the Book of Acts is really our only historical source about how Christianity spread from the resurrection of Jesus to the centrality of Paul's missions. And it gives us this really nice explanation for how Christianity moved from a Jerusalem-centered movement and moved out through the Roman Empire to all the nations and became a Gentile movement. Here's the problem. When we look at the Book of Acts and actually ask some tough questions about its value as a historical source, we see that the author of the Book of Acts, whose name was Luke, is not really writing history. Luke is actually writing mythology. Now, if you are screaming at your screen and saying, this liberal biblical scholar is just here to tear everything apart, I'm sorry. I wish this held up as a historical source. I really wish this was just a simple explanation for how Christianity grew and spread, but I don't think it holds water. So in this video, I'm going to explain to you why I think Acts is mythology. I'm going to point out some serious historical problems, questions with the Book of Acts, and I'm going to tell you why I actually find this a really exciting prospect and not sad at all. It's actually really cool for studying early Christianity. Before we get started, I should say my name is Chris. I have an MDiv, an MA in theology, a PhD in Christian origins, and on this channel I talk about Christianity, ancient and modern. So if you haven't done so yet, please do take a second and subscribe. So what does it mean when I say that the Book of Acts is mythology? I think most of us, when we hear the word mythology, we hear the word made up or fake or legend. And that's not actually what I mean about the Book of Acts. Now, I'm not saying it's all historically accurate. I think there are probably some reasons to think it might not be, and I will talk about those in this video. But mythology is actually something a little bit different. Mythology is a larger than life, maybe even supernatural account for the foundation of something. And that's, I think, what we have with the Book of Acts. We have a really powerful, incredible foundation story for the birth of Christianity. And some of it might certainly be based in real events, but I think there's probably a fair amount of it that I'm sorry to say is probably not. And I'll explain why as we go. First of all, the Book of Acts is a really satisfying read for any Christian who really has these questions after reading the Gospels. You finish the Gospels, you're like, okay, what happened to Jesus next? What happened to Judas? Where did the disciples go from there? Where did this Paul guy come from? And the Book of Acts pretty much answers every single one of these questions. You start with this miraculous ascension of Jesus right at the beginning, and you move all the way through Paul's missionary journeys. But right off the bat, the way that it answers these questions is already sort of strange. I mean, for example, with the ascension of Jesus, you already have a difference between at the end of Luke, where it says that Jesus ascended in Bethany pretty much right away after his resurrection, and in Acts, you have Jesus ascending from the Mount of Olives 40 days after his resurrection. By the way, these were both written by the same author. So apparently Luke is doing a little more than just telling careful history. And of course, probably most famously, you get this story of Pentecost, that Jesus goes up and the Spirit comes down. These tongues of fire come down on people's heads. They're speaking in other languages. Sort of replicates a lot of the themes from the Gospels. You have a godly centurion, just like in the Gospels. You have the apostles, Peter and John especially. For example, there's shadow falling on people and healing them, just like you had Jesus' garment healing people in the Gospels. You have them healing people who can't walk, even raising the dead, just like the miracles of Jesus in the Gospel. So you kind of get this like gospel second act by the apostles doing a lot of the same things. And these apostles who were so scared and timid in the Gospels, who often didn't know what was going on, were often confused, now totally get it. They're totally clued in. They're leading, they're giving these incredible speeches in front of like all the smartest people, and they are converting a lot of people. And that's where I want to start. As we talk about mythology in the rate of Acts, let's talk about conversion. The Book of Acts gives us a story of exceptional conversion rates to Christianity. We start with 3,000 in a single day. Acts 4:4, it goes up to 5,000. By Acts 5 and 6, we have even more added. We don't have specific numbers. So Luke is basically saying in the earliest chapters of Acts that not long after the foundation of the Christian movement, you have well over 5,000 Christians in Jerusalem. And this should give us pause. And I think there's some clues here that Luke may be myth-making. Josephus does report at this time that the population of Jerusalem was well over 1 million, but we should probably be a little bit skeptical of those numbers. In fact, archaeologists and historians have estimated that the population of Jerusalem was probably anywhere from about 35 to 70,000 people at this time, maybe as high as 100,000 on the high side, but this is based on things like the archaeological data and the availability of water to actually feed the city. By the time we look at Luke's conversion numbers and compare these to the actual population of Jerusalem, we're probably looking at a movement, early Christianity, that would have been 5 to 14% of the population of Jerusalem. And this is quite high, I think. Now, call me a cynical historian if you want, that's fine. Maybe Luke is dealing with historical numbers, but remember, Luke was writing long after these events apparently happened, long after the destruction of the temple by the Romans. So there's really no way to fact check Luke at this point because we're talking a long time later. And once Luke has this huge core of Christians in Jerusalem, he also has a really good explanation for why it spread outward, because there was persecution in Jerusalem. And in reality, it probably spread outward because the Romans attacked. Apparently we have this mass movement of thousands of people connected to the temple if you read the book of Acts. In fact, what's happening here is Luke is giving us a really powerful mythological point, a mass growth of Christianity, mass recognition, mass movement by the Spirit. And even though this is probably not historically accurate, or at the very least it's probably embellished a little bit, it is a really great founding narrative for a movement that wants to understand where it came from. But then there's this other mythological thing Luke does. He ties the movement to all these famous people. And Luke reports this incredible speech by Gamaliel that kind of helps to isolate two historical moments. So Gamaliel references in his speech somebody named Theudas and an uprising under Judas the Galilean. Now, here's the problem. Here's this problem with this speech by Gamaliel. Apparently, Luke gets it wrong because Josephus reports that Theudas' uprising actually happened about 10 to 15 years after this alleged speech by Gamaliel. Remember, we're talking about the weeks and months after Jesus was crucified. And this Theudas guy actually took part in a revolt between 44 and 46. And then there's the other problem, Judas the Galilean. So Judas the Galilean actually led an uprising in 6 AD or CE. So here in Gamaliel's speech, he actually mixes up the order of things. He actually says that first came Theudas and then came Judas, but actually Theudas came long after Gamaliel's alleged speech here, and Judas came decades before. But this is kind of the point, because it doesn't really matter. Luke's readers probably don't know, but Luke is tying the birth of Christianity to this historic event and this really important figure. Rabbi Gamaliel was a larger-than-life figure, and you can even find references to his own mythology within the Jewish tradition as well. Rabbi Gamaliel was a big deal. And here, Rabbi Gamaliel serves, first of all, to kind of legitimize the Christian tradition, because there were a lot of revolts and uprisings at this point. But Rabbi Gamaliel says, well, here are all these other uprisings, but Christianity, if it's real, if it's from God, then it's gonna survive. And if not, then why fight against it? So in doing so, Luke links Christianity to this incredible figure. And remember, Luke also in Acts says that Paul studied under Rabbi Gamaliel. Now, I think it would have been a really nice thing for the Apostle Paul in his own letters at some point to confirm that this was true. But the Apostle Paul never actually says that he studied under Gamaliel. Remember when he talks about how he's a Hebrew of the Hebrews or under the law perfect, he never says, by the way, I studied under Rabbi Gamaliel. You think that would be something worth noting. In fact, this is probably made up, but the real question is why it's made up. Because it helps Luke, as he's creating this mythology, it helps him tie it to real historical events his audience would recognize, even if it's not done perfectly, helps him tie it to Rabbi Gamaliel, helps him tie Paul to Rabbi Gamaliel, and you have this Christian movement that all of a sudden is recognized and noticed by really important people in history. And in the words of this famous Jewish Rabbi Gamaliel, he says, if it succeeds, this Christian movement is from God. And that is some pretty powerful myth making. The third thing that Luke does with his myth making is he presents this utopian community in which everybody sells everything they have. They have everything in common, in koinonia. He uses all this virtue, Aristotelian language of a virtuous type of community. In fact, this community that he paints a picture of was literally the ideal community in terms of how it operated for the vast majority of social groups at this time. Apparently the Pythagoreans lived like this and were legendary for it. Philo reports that there's this group called the Therapeutai near Alexandria, and Philo says they abandon their property to relatives and friends, they surrender their possessions, making voluntary poverty their riches. Philo idealizes this group, and in the book of Acts we get a very similar description of the Christian community. They have everything in common, they sell what they have, they take care of each other. It's utopian. And again, I don't know if this is an accurate description of early Christian communities, but as far as myth making goes, it's really powerful. Then the fourth mythological element, the education of these men, the brilliance, the speeches. You look at the rhetorical prowess of these men who were apparently Galilean fishermen shortly before this period. Acts 4:13 has this audience listening to these speeches, and Peter and John, these men actually say Peter and John are unlettered men. Anthropoi e grammatoi literally means they were illiterate, which is an interesting thing since there are later letters attributed to both Peter and a gospel attributed to John. But let's leave that aside for now. But through the power of myth making, Luke can transform them into orators, into philosophers who can impress even these educated people listening. They didn't go through years of education, the paideia, which would be so valuable in a Greco-Roman society. They just sort of have it. And I don't think modern readers who have been educated actually notice this, because we take education for granted. But this is actually part of the miracle. This is part of the mythology. And of course, we know Paul is somebody who may have had a bit more education than this, a bit more training, but we even see the same thing in Paul, that Paul is this really powerful rhetorical force, and everybody who listens to him is amazed by him. And ironically, there's one more detail you might not have noticed, because Apollos, who is actually a competitor of Paul talks about in Corinthians how he's, Apollos is actually another kind of competing figure. Apollos actually doesn't know about the Spirit. Paul does. So Apollos, this educated man from Alexandria, has to come and learn about the baptism of the Spirit from Priscilla and Aquila, who are only tent makers. It's a total inversion. It's powerful mythology that all of a sudden the educated are being taught by these people who have no education. 5, most of the myth making centers around the figure of Paul, this guy who goes from zero to hero. I already said that Paul never mentioned he studied under Gamaliel. He never mentioned that he was present at Stephen's stoning. And actually, if you read Galatians 1:18, Paul says that he didn't go to Jerusalem for at least 3 years after his conversion. Here, Paul is actually injected right into the action right from the beginning, persecuting this vibrant, explosive, growing church that Luke paints a picture of. Luke here makes Paul out to be both a super Jew who was present at the beginning of the movement, who had all these credentials in Judaism, but also a Roman citizen. And by the way, Paul never actually mentions he was a Roman citizen in his own letters. So this again is powerful myth making around the figure of Paul. But there's one final thing I want to point out, because this one hit me while I was doing my PhD thesis. I wanted to study diasporas in antiquity. I wanted to look at how Christianity spread through diaspora and say, okay, there must have been other diasporas. But as I looked at this, I actually realized that the diasporas, the Jewish diasporas, now there were a lot of Jewish diasporas in antiquity. There were huge Jewish communities around the Mediterranean. But the link between Christianity and the birth of Christianity within diasporas is actually kind of questionable, because it functions here as just a little more myth-making by Luke. If you look through Acts, you will see a pattern that repeats itself again and again. Paul goes into a new city. He goes to the synagogue first. The Jews kind of reject, and then he goes out to the God-fearers or to the Gentiles. Now, it's very possible that Paul traveled and went to Jewish synagogues and tried to preach. I mean, that's kind of understandable. And considering you have in several of Paul's letters, he's obviously talking to an audience who knows Judaism very well, knows the Septuagint very well. It's reasonable to suspect that the Jewish diaspora had something to do with the spread of Christianity. But what happens here in Acts is it's again clearly functioning as a literary device. Because if you look at what Luke wants to do with Acts, and it's true for the Gospel of Luke as well, Luke's whole thing is trying to explain how a Jewish movement moved outward and became relevant to the Gentiles. And by doing this thing where in Pisidian Antioch, in Iconium, in Thessalonica, in Corinth, in Ephesus, Paul goes to a synagogue, gets rejected, and goes out to the Gentiles, you actually have a really nice generation mythology about how Gentile Christianity started. That, we tried to get the Jews first, but they didn't want it, so we went to the Gentiles. And even in doing this, again, I'm not saying there's no historical reality behind this. There could be, but even this is myth-making. Even the use of diaspora in Acts is myth-making because it's actually using it as this place where Christianity can originate and Paul can kind of get started there, but inevitably he has to go out to the Gentiles. And when you see this, you are looking at the final part of Luke's myth-making. Now, there are a bunch of other things that don't necessarily line up in Acts as a historical source, but I'm not going to talk about any more of those today because I think I've given you enough on myth-making in the book of Acts. I've given you enough about the mythology, but let's talk about why this is exciting. Because for most of Christian history, we've looked at Acts as if it is just a simple explanation of what happened. But when you start to pull this apart, there are people who are going to react to this. There are people who are going to come for me in the comments probably and be really pissed off because we have this precious little story about the birth of Christianity, and God forbid we should ever question it. But if you stop to realize, this doesn't really hold water as a historical theory, elements of it could be true, but it's not just a straightforward historical thing. You look at it and you're like, well, what actually happened? And you realize that it actually creates a really incredibly exciting point for people studying early Christianity. Because one of the problems with thinking we have the answers laid out for us is we don't ask the right questions. And for centuries within the study of Christianity, people took Acts to be a historical document. But when you look at the mythology in Acts, it's obviously not. It's obviously creating a narrative. Again, there may be historical details there. I don't know. I actually think in many cases, they're probably not. Luke is probably fabricating a lot of this, pulling from other sources, pulling from other stories about, from the Gospels, pulling from maybe from Josephus, which is an ongoing question. Luke is pulling from different sources to create this fabrication of the birth of Christianity. And if we can set that aside, all of a sudden we can ask the interesting questions. How did this movement get started? Where did it come from? How did it grow? How did it move beyond Jerusalem? I already mentioned maybe it was because of the Roman attacks. How did this movement become such a powerful movement that would become the religion of the Roman Empire? That's a really interesting question, and it also is why it's such an interesting time to be studying early Christianity. I hope that this is interesting to you. I hope that you see that anything is on the table. We can ask any questions about the birth of Christianity, and there are still explanations, there's still work to be done here, and there are things that we will discover in the future that we don't even know yet. And for me, as somebody who, eats, sleeps, and breathes this stuff, I think that that's super exciting. So once again, I'd love to know what you think about this in the comments. Do let me know what stands out to you in Acts. Let me know what you think about the birth of Christianity, what questions are interesting to you, especially if you throw out the cookie cutter answers that you were given from the book of Acts. What are then for you the most interesting questions? Do take a minute and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Got lots of other great videos coming your way, and I will see you next time.